The political earthquake that just hit Westminster has left Keir Starmer's government in absolute chaos. Richard Tice has just dropped a bombshell that's sending shockwaves through every Labour and Liberal Democrat council in Britain. What started as a routine parliamentary session has exploded into a full-blown crisis that has Starmer scrambling for answers. The migrant housing crisis just took a turn nobody saw coming, and the fallout is nothing short of devastating. This isn't just another political debate. This is war, and Reform UK just fired the shot that's about to change everything. The chamber fell silent as Richard Tice rose to his feet, but what came next was anything but quiet. The Reform UK deputy leader didn't just speak, he detonated a political nuclear weapon right in the heart of Parliament. With calculated precision and undeniable fury, Tice unveiled a plan that has sent the entire Labour establishment into absolute meltdown. He's demanding that migrant housing be redistributed exclusively to Labour and Liberal Democrat council areas. Yes, you heard that right. Every single migrant arrival, every asylum seeker, every person crossing the channel illegally. Tice wants them housed in the constituencies that voted for open border policies. And the reasoning? Brutal, simple and devastatingly effective. If you vote for unlimited immigration, then you deal with the consequences. The reaction was instantaneous. Labour benches erupted in fury. Lib Dem MPs looked like they'd seen a ghost. But Tice wasn't finished. Not even close. He stood there, unwavering, as the chamber descended into chaos around him and methodically laid out exactly why this policy makes perfect sense. For years, he argued, working class communities in reform-supporting areas have been forced to absorb the impact of mass migration, while wealthy Labour MPs in their comfortable London townhouses lecture everyone about compassion and diversity. Meanwhile, their own leafy suburbs remain mysteriously untouched by the very policies they champion. The hypocrisy, Tice declared, ends now. If Labour and the Lib Dems want open borders, then they can open their own communities to house the consequences. Starmer's face told the entire story. The Prime Minister sat frozen, his usual composure shattered as Tice systematically dismantled every defence the government had prepared. This wasn't just a political attack, this was a strategic masterclass in exposing the massive disconnect between Labour's immigration rhetoric and the reality facing ordinary British communities. Tice pulled out statistics, council data, housing figures, all of it painting the same damning picture. Conservative and reform areas have been disproportionately burdened with migrant housing for years, while Labour strongholds somehow managed to avoid the strain. The numbers don't lie, and Tice made absolutely certain everyone in that chamber knew it. But here's where it gets even more explosive. Tice didn't just propose this as some theoretical exercise or political point scoring. He's actually pushing for legislation, real binding legal requirements that would force Labour and Lib Dem councils to take their fair share, actually more than their fair share, of migrant accommodation. The proposal includes specific quotas based on how MPs voted on immigration bills, how councils have historically welcomed or rejected asylum housing, and even factors in the public statements made by local Labour politicians about immigration. If your MP stood up and said Britain should welcome more migrants, congratulations, your area just moved to the top of the housing allocation list. It's political judo at its finest, using Labour's own words and votes as the weapon to beat them with. The genius of Tice's move extends far beyond the immediate chaos it's created. He's essentially forced Labour into an impossible position. If they oppose the plan, they're admitting that even they don't want to deal with the consequences of their own immigration policies. They're confessing that mass migration is fine as long as it happens somewhere else, to someone else, in someone else's community. But if they accept it, if they actually agree to house migrants in their own constituencies, they're going to face an electoral bloodbath from their own voters. Those comfortable metropolitan liberals who love tweeting about diversity and inclusion might feel very differently when asylum hotels start appearing on their own high streets. Tice has created a perfect political trap and Starmer has walked straight into it. The Labour benches tried to fight back, of course. They shouted about racism, about cruelty, about lacking compassion. But every accusation fell flat because Tice had already addressed it. This isn't about racism, he fired back. This is about fairness. This is about making sure that the people who vote for these policies actually experience them firsthand. If you genuinely believe mass migration is enriching and beneficial, then surely you'd welcome the opportunity to experience that enrichment in your own community. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody on the Labour side had an answer because there isn't one. They've been caught out, exposed for the hypocrites they are, and the whole country is watching. Social media exploded within minutes. The hashtag Tice Destroys Starmer started trending immediately. Video clips of the exchange went viral, racking up millions of views as people across Britain watched Labour MPs squirm under the weight of their own contradictions. The comment sections were brutal. Ordinary voters, people from traditional Labour heartlands who've watched their communities change beyond recognition, were cheering Tice's intervention. Finally, they said, someone is standing up for us. Finally, someone is calling out this insane double standard. The disconnect between Westminster and the real Britain has never been clearer, and Reform UK just drove a truck through it. But the chaos was only just beginning. As news of Tice's proposals spread beyond Parliament, the reaction from Labour councils was nothing short of panic. Council leaders who've spent years virtue signalling about welcoming refugees suddenly found themselves facing the prospect of actually having to back up those words with actions. The backpedalling started almost immediately. Camden Council, long a bastion of progressive politics and open border advocacy, released a statement claiming they lack the infrastructure to accommodate large numbers of migrants. Islington, another Labour stronghold where MPs regularly condemn the government's supposedly harsh immigration policies, suddenly discovered they have a housing shortage that makes additional asylum accommodation impossible. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Lambeth Council tried a different approach, arguing that concentrating migrants in specific areas would be bad for integration and community cohesion. Let that sink in for a moment. The same councils that have lectured working class communities for years about embracing diversity are now claiming that too much diversity in their own areas would be problematic. The same politicians who called anyone questioning mass migration racist are now using integration concerns as an excuse to avoid housing migrants themselves. You genuinely couldn't make this up. The hypocrisy on display was so staggering that even some Labour supporters started questioning whether their party actually believes anything it says about immigration. Reform UK supporters were having an absolute field day. Nigel Farage himself weighed in, calling Tice's proposal the most brilliant piece of political strategy he's seen in years. And he's right. What Tice has done is expose the fundamental lie at the heart of progressive immigration politics, that it's all compassion and moral superiority until it affects you personally. Every Labour MP who's ever accused immigration critics of racism, every Lib Dem councillor who's ever posted about welcoming refugees, they're all now faced with a simple choice: put up or shut up, accept migrants in your own communities, or admit you're hypocrites who only support mass migration when someone else has to deal with it. The government's response was a masterclass in avoiding the question. Starmer refused to directly address Tice's proposal during Prime Minister's questions, instead deflecting to vague platitudes about Britain's proud tradition of offering sanctuary and our international obligations. But the journalists weren't letting him off that easily. Why, they asked, do reform-supporting areas have disproportionately high numbers of asylum accommodations if the government is distributing them fairly? Why do Labour strongholds seem to avoid the impact? Starmer had no answer. His press secretary had no answer. Nobody in government had an answer because there isn't a good one. The truth is exactly what Tice said. Mass migration is fine as long as wealthy Labour voters don't have to experience it. The polling started coming in and it was devastating for Labour. A Snap survey found that 73% of voters, including 41% of Labour voters, supported Tice's proposal that areas whose MPs vote for increased immigration should house proportionally more migrants. Even among Labour's own base, the message was clear. People are tired of the hypocrisy. They're tired of being lectured about tolerance and diversity by people who live in areas completely insulated from the effects of mass migration. The political realignment everyone's been talking about suddenly looked very real. Reform UK wasn't just winning the argument. They were winning over former Labour voters who felt abandoned and betrayed by their own party. Behind the scenes, Labour MPs were in full panic mode. Backbenchers from London constituencies were frantically calling party headquarters, demanding that leadership kill this proposal before it gains any more traction. MPs from safe Labour seats were suddenly realising that Tice's plan could turn their comfortable majorities into marginals overnight. Because here's the thing, when you've spent years telling your constituents that immigration is wonderful and enriching, it becomes very difficult to then oppose having migrants housed in your own area without looking like a complete hypocrite. Labour MPs found themselves trapped between betraying their progressive principles or betraying their voters. Either way, they lose. The Liberal Democrats somehow managed to be even worse. Ed Davey initially tried to dismiss Tice's proposal as a political stunt, but when pressed on whether Lib Dem areas should accept more asylum housing, he stumbled through a non-answer that satisfied nobody. The Lib Dems have built their entire identity on being more progressive than Labour, more welcoming, more compassionate. But when actually challenged to demonstrate that compassion in their own constituencies, they ran for the hills. Their hypocrisy was even more blatant than Labour's because they don't even have the excuse of trying to win over working class voters anymore. The Lib Dems are the party of wealthy suburbanites who want to feel morally superior without making any actual sacrifices. Tice just called their bluff. The implications of this political earthquake extend far beyond just the immediate chaos in Westminster. What Tice has done is fundamentally reframe the entire immigration debate in Britain. For decades, the conversation has been controlled by progressives who could paint anyone questioning mass migration as racist or lacking compassion. They held the moral high ground, or at least they claimed to, and used it to shut down legitimate concerns from communities directly affected by rapid demographic change. But now the tables have turned. Now the question isn't whether you support immigration. It's whether you're willing to personally experience the consequences of the policies you advocate. And that changes everything. Conservative areas that have been forced to accommodate asylum hotels and migrant housing facilities are watching this unfold with grim satisfaction. For years, they've complained about the unfair distribution, about being dumped with responsibilities while Labour areas escape scrutiny. Finally, someone with a national platform is saying what they've been saying all along. The coastal towns that have seen hotels requisitioned for asylum seekers, the working class communities that have experienced rapid demographic shifts, they all feel vindicated. This isn't racism, as Labour constantly claims. This is about fairness. This is about demanding that everyone shares the burden equally instead of loading it all onto areas that voted the wrong way. Labour's coalition is fracturing in real time. The party has tried to hold together two completely incompatible groups. Working class voters in post-industrial towns who are concerned about immigration, and metropolitan progressives who view opposition to mass migration as moral failure. That coalition has been crumbling for years. It's why so many red wall seats fell in 2019. But Tice's proposal is accelerating the collapse because now Labour can't hide behind vague rhetoric about compassion and asylum obligations. They have to make a concrete choice: side with their progressive base and accept migrants in wealthy Labour areas, or side with working class voters and admit that unlimited immigration has real negative consequences. There's no fudge available anymore. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Britain's asylum system is already under massive strain, with record numbers crossing the channel and accommodation costs spiralling out of control. The government had been trying to quietly distribute migrants across the country in a way that minimised political backlash, which in practice meant dumping them in areas least likely to complain loudly or vote Labour out. But if Tice's proposal gains traction, that entire strategy collapses. Suddenly, every council allocation becomes a political battlefield. Every decision about where to house asylum seekers becomes national news. The government loses the ability to quietly manage the crisis and instead faces constant scrutiny over which areas are being asked to accommodate new arrivals. Some Labour councils try to argue that they already take their fair share of migrants, pointing to refugee resettlement programmes and asylum dispersal schemes. But the data told a very different story. When independent researchers actually crunched the numbers, they found massive disparities. Conservative-held coastal areas and northern towns were housing asylum seekers at rates 3 or 4 times higher than equivalent Labour-controlled areas. The excuse that cities were more diverse and therefore better equipped for integration fell apart when you looked at which specific parts of those cities were actually receiving migrants. Spoiler alert, it wasn't the wealthy, progressive neighbourhoods. It was the same working class areas that already felt abandoned by Labour. The business community started weighing in, adding yet another dimension to the crisis. Employers who rely on migrant labour warned that concentrating new arrivals in specific areas based on political voting patterns would be economically disastrous. But their complaints rang hollow to voters who've watched wages stagnate and job security evaporate while businesses profited from cheap imported labour. The disconnect between corporate interests and working class concerns has never been sharper. Tice's proposal resonated because it wasn't about economics or labour markets or GDP growth. It was about fairness, about making sure that the people advocating for these policies actually experience them, not just the people whose objections get dismissed as racism. Reform UK's momentum continued building. Membership applications surged. Donations flooded in. Most importantly, polling showed them pulling ahead of the Conservatives in key constituencies and eating into Labour's support in traditional heartlands. The political establishment tried to dismiss it as a temporary spike, a flash in the pan that would fade once the news cycle moved on. But this felt different. This felt like one of those rare moments when the entire political landscape shifts. Tice hadn't just scored a political point. He'd tapped into something deep and genuine in British public opinion. The sense that ordinary people are constantly told to accept consequences that their leaders never face themselves. The Conservative Party found itself in an awkward position. Many Tory MPs privately agreed with Tice's proposal, but the party leadership was reluctant to fully endorse it for fear of appearing too closely aligned with Reform UK. But their base was watching, and Conservative voters made their feelings crystal clear. They wanted their MPs to support Tice's plan to stand up for fairness and equal distribution of asylum accommodation. The pressure on Conservative leadership to back the proposal grew by the hour. If they failed to support it, they risked hemorrhaging even more support to reform. But if they did support it, they'd be admitting that the Conservative government had also failed to fairly distribute migrants during their time in power.